Hello, everyone, and either welcome or welcome back to the Gender Libertarian podcast. If you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and on my Patreon page, where you do get early access to my content, plus also exclusive content. The link will be down in the show notes. So for this episode, I sit down with Nick Gillespie, which I'm sure if you're listening to this, I do not need to introduce Nick to you, but for the sake of doing a proper podcast intro, I will do it anyway. Nick Gillespie is one of the editors-at-large of Reason, and he is the former editor-in-chief of both the print version of Reason and Reason.com, and he is also the host of the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie, which, by the way, if you do subscribe to the Reason podcast and you were kind of wondering where your content is, what they did is they split up the content into 3 separate streams. It used to all be on one podcast stream, but now there is a separate stream for the Monday Reason Editors Roundtable. There is another stream for the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie that comes out on Wednesdays. And then there is a separate stream for the Soho Forum podcast, which comes out once a month. And it's basically an audio recording of whatever the Soho Forum happened to be that month. So if you are interested in getting all of that content into your podcast catcher, you need to go and subscribe to all 3 of those feeds. So, like I said, if you were wondering where your content was, there's your explanation. So, like I was saying, Nick and I sit down and we talk about all kinds of things, about journalism and the state of it, and kind of just a long, wide-ranging conversation on that. We talk about libertarianism and how that has grown and evolved too, and plenty of other stuff in the middle. It's a long, winding conversation, which I personally enjoy these kinds of conversations. I love recording these kinds of conversations. I like listening to these conversations. I hope you guys like listening to these kinds of conversations too. So let's go ahead and get into my interview with Nick. Okay, so today I'm talking to Nick Gillespie, who I'm sure I don't have to introduce to anybody, but he is an editor-at-large for Reason right now. Was the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine and Reason.com, and does the Reason podcast with Nick Gillespie for Reason, obviously. Not that any of you didn't already know that, but there you go. So say hi to everyone, Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie. Thanks for having me. I also, can I point out, I also helped launch our video platform, Reason TV, which is now just Reason Video, kind of, but so...
Yes, way back in the day. Kind of, was that about the same time as Reason.com?
No, it was actually much later. Reason.com launched in 1994. We had a website that we didn't do all that much with until about 2000, but Reason TV launched in October of 2007. So that's more recent, but that, it's already a dozen years, so screw it.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that that's been a dozen years already. But to kind of segue into the first thing that I want to talk to you about, and that is your career, not just with Reason, but in journalism in general, because you are kind of one of the last of a dying breed, and that is somebody who can actually say that they were the editor-in-chief of an actual, honest-to-God, print magazine that people got in the mail and bought in stores. And also, obviously, being the editor-in-chief of Reason.com until 2017. So, and not just pertaining to Reason, but kind of your whole career arc in general. Kind of explain how did you
my
get
career
here?
Arc is not bending towards justice. My career arc is going down. It's towards the grave. You said I'm a dying breed, and I don't think I'm a dying breed, but I am certainly dying. Yeah. So... with that as a kind of throat clearing, Reason was founded in 1968 as a kind of irregularly published mimeograph magazine by a student at Boston University named Lanny Friedlander. I entered the picture 26 years ago in the fall of 1993. And my background had been I went to college, ended up writing for newspapers and some teen magazines, movie magazines, music magazines in Manhattan in the late 80s or mid 80s, late 80s. Went to grad school, hooked up with Reason in 1993. I always had a great affinity for print. I mean, I love the physical object, whether it's a magazine or whether it's a book or even a newspaper. But those days are over, and I'm not looking back. I don't think anybody should. We still publish a magazine, which actually looks great. It looks better than it has in years, really. For me, all of that stuff is secondary to the information. The information is what's important, and the medium in which you send it around, the container, whether it's print, a Dead Tree page or a website or a video or a podcast, that's always more important.
How is it different being the editor-in-chief of a print magazine versus being the editor-in-chief of more of like a digital, online, whatever people want to call people getting news on the internet, and whatever people want to call portals for that now? It seems to change on a daily basis, but...
Yeah, it's, what is most fascinating, I think, or maybe not fascinating, but most different is with the web, or instant publishing, because it's not merely the difference between being a daily newspaper or online or a monthly magazine or whatever. Online, people expect you to be weighing in much more quickly and also much more kind of currently. So one of the things that has changed for sure at Reason, I think, over the past couple of decades, but I think over the course of its existence, and I think this is typical everywhere, is, you're expected to get into the conversation much quicker. And that, that's good on certain levels, because it means that instead of waiting 6 or 8 weeks for, the idea of a story coming in, working through a manuscript, finalizing everything, getting it to a printer, and then mailing it around, you can weigh in, within moments. I mean, this morning, within, 45 minutes or an hour of Nancy Pelosi announcing articles of impeachment, or telling the Democratic Congress to actually write up articles of impeachment, I had a piece, up at the website. That was, just unfathomable circa 1993. So that's really, that's a big difference. It's good, but it also changes your mode of thinking. And one of the things that I worry about is that we do tend to live more and more extremely in the minute. You have a very lively Twitter feed, and you know what that's like, right? And, and the quicker you are, the kind of shorter you have to be. And not always, but often the more superficial you need to be. So I think, one of the things that we're striving to do at Reason, I think most people are doing this, is a mix of really fast, kind of first thought, best thought, to kind of paraphrase Allen Ginsberg, but then also that longer, slower thinking and analysis, which can only come with time. I think a lot of good journalism, whether it's video or audio or writing, it's kind of like baking a cake. Like, you can put everything together, but you got to let it sit. You got to let the dough rise. You got to let the cake bake. And I've already exhausted my cooking knowledge. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, and I do think Reason does a really good job of that. And I think another reason why is because you do still have the print magazine, whether you get it as Dead Tree form or you have a digital subscription. So you do still have to invest in making those kind of 10,000 word deep dive pieces that obviously you put on reason.com too, but you also have to make them for the actual print version. So it kind of helps to balance things
down.
Yeah.
Yeah. And video is actually like that in a lot of, we started Reason TV, like I said, in late 2007. And it's, we started out mostly doing documentaries, and then we also started doing a lot of interviews, and we do a variety of other things as well. But, that takes time no matter what, because we rarely do something where it's like, a bunch of kittens are trapped in a tree at 11 a.m., so we want to have a story up by noon or something, and that takes time. But it is really a balancing act between trying to get out as quickly as possible and then doing kind of serious work. And I don't even think it's a question of fact checking and that kind of stuff, or quick, good editing and all of that. There is this dimension, and I think within the broader libertarian sphere, this, it's important to have people who are mixing it up, like on a minute by minute hourly basis. But then we also want to have people, scattered throughout all of the, various things that comprise the libertarian movement, who are taking time and really thinking through things, because, and it's similar. I have an academic background, and I have a lot of friends who are academics. It's easy to make fun of academics who take a decade to write a monograph on something, but it's a different type of expertise, and it's a meaningful type. I mean, there's a lot of crap that is written in academia. There's a lot of crap that's written on Twitter and everything in between. But, actually recognizing the difference between somebody who is taking time on something and really developing it, and somebody who's knocking something off real quick. That's important, and it's all necessary.
Yeah, and I think this is something that, for lack of a better term, a lot of new media publications, especially the online onlys, there is this balancing act that I think they're trying to find, especially sites like Vox and BuzzFeed, that everybody likes to slag on them for, and there are legitimate reasons to do so, but there is also good journalism coming out of those places too. And it's kind of, and I try to explain this to people a lot, especially when people want to bring up topics like, oh, the clickbait and bias and shit like that. It's like, okay, you need to understand kind of why this is happening and why certain publications have to be this way and certain publications kind of have the freedom to not be that way. And Reason is lucky in that you're not like BuzzFeed or Vox or Slate or any of the online only publications where you're reliant solely on ad revenue to try to fund yourselves. Like you have Reason Foundation, you have the print magazine that generates revenue. So I kind of want to talk about and get your opinion on kind of like, I refer to it as kind of like the new incentive structure for journalism and for why publications write what they write and how they write it, and kind of how, as much as we bitch about it, we do play into it too, because we click, we click, we read through, we retweet it, we talk about it. So it's like this monster that exists, but it also exists because, well, it's kind of our fault too.
Yeah, and it's, you can do on all of this stuff, like you can do good or bad long form, slow moving, journalism, and you can do good or bad clickbait. So that's kind of, there's that axis to think about. It's there's also the ideological axes of things. I mean, as I think of, I'm a professional libertarian. I kind of, I don't know why sometimes I shudder at that self-description, but it's like, I'm in journalism because that's the toolkit that I've assembled over the years. But my main interest in writing and thinking and talking and yapping and all of that is really to advance a worldview that, and within that broad libertarian movement, we have a lot of disagreement, but, there are core principles about things like individualism and, being left alone and kind of free enterprise, non-interventionism, et cetera. We need in that movement, we need people who are, really kind of, flicking matches, lit matches at people the minute that something stupid happens. And then we need the deep thinkers who are spending, a couple of decades writing a great book that really changes the way that everybody thinks about things and everything in between. I do think there are mixed incentives, and this also, I'm kind of a Marxist in the sense that I believe that kind of an economic base actually changes what kind of a certain doctrinaire Marxists would say is the cultural superstructure, and something like clickbait. And you're right. If you are on a website that lives and dies by the number of page views it can get for advertising, it does predispose sites to certain types of treatment, certain types of coverage, just to get as many eyeballs on something as quickly as possible. Having said that, there's places like BuzzFeed, which is both like kind of the master of clickbait, and of listicles and of kind of silly, which Nazi character from Hogan's Heroes are you, play this quiz or something like that, and they string you out over 50 pages. But they've also done long-form, informative, investigative journalism too, and that all builds up. And I think, I am not a declinist. Like, I know a lot of people. I'm in my mid 50s now, and I know a lot of people my age and even younger people who are like, oh, well, online stuff is by definition shallow and superficial. I think that's all horseshit. And I think we're kind of in the best of all possible worlds because, and as we increasingly migrate to online and instant distribution of things, what's great about the internet is that it doesn't mean that you have to write fast and stupid. What it means is that when you hit that publish button, you can immediately get it out to a global audience in a way that was just totally impossible even 25 years ago.
Which that is a double-edged sword in and of itself, because sometimes you mash that publish button and really you should have maybe thought about it a little bit longer before mashing that button.
But don't you think, I mean, and this is one of the things that, I mean, we all have said things that we regret and whatnot, but it's also, it changes the way that we consume things. And I feel like, and I like this because I think it comports broadly with a kind of libertarian understanding of knowledge and authority and power and things like that, which is that, when you are putting stuff out there really quickly, and there's an audience that can talk back to you directly in a way that was impossible again, or very hard to do in the past. Like, everybody kind of, like, you have to be more transparent. And you have to be more transparent in your biases, in your claims, in the mistakes that you make, and the corrections that you make. And I think overall that the flow of information has gotten a lot better, even as it's gotten, the volume has just increased and whatnot. But I like living in this world where, as a writer or as a video person or as a podcaster, you get immediate feedback, and you also have a strong sense of like whether or not your stuff is being read or by whom or whatnot. It means that I try to condition, my claims to make sure that I am putting forth the best understanding I have, at a current moment, but it's automatically subject to revision, and that revision has to be public and acknowledged. And I want to see that kind of dynamic filter through every aspect of the contemporary world. I mean, again, we're talking about this on, I guess we're recording this on December 5th. Nancy Pelosi has just brought in, or said, let's impeach Donald Trump. The Judiciary Committee is going to write up the articles and stuff like that. I want to see a government, that is bound by that, where they have to, they can't evade their mistakes or their misstatements of fact as quickly as possible. So, it's a very different world. And I think, again, I'm pretty optimistic about stuff. I think it's a much better world because we have more knowledge, and everybody, this is the difference between being in a kind of hierarchical world where, there were publishers and authors with capital P and capital A, and they would just, and broadcasters with a capital B who would just beam out signals or send stuff out, and they really didn't, give a shit what any of the readers thought, and they didn't even know. I mean, I think one of the things that's going on with legacy media, which hasn't fully worked through the system yet, is that a lot of well-known writers, had to grapple with the fact that nobody was really reading their stuff, whether it was in the New York Times or the Atlantic or wherever. And, because of the way that internet culture works and digital culture works, you know that pretty quickly. And, it's kind of a brutal reckoning, but it's a leveling of the producer and the consumer in a way that blurs things in. I think a liberating and very libertarian way.
I can see that. And it's also, I know a lot of people kind of bemoan the whole, well, we've lost all the gatekeepers. And I'm like, yeah, but is that really such a bad thing? I mean, now it's kind of created this market for people like me to do this.
No, I mean, think about it, somebody like, Matt Drudge, I mean, it's kind of phenomenal. And it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't get rid of gatekeepers. It just opens up, it kind of deregulates gatekeeping so that we all have a better shot now of building up a reputation and building our audience. And it doesn't mean you can get away with anything. It just means that you have a better shot. When you think of some of the heroes of the internet or of the early web age in the 90s and stuff, people like Matt Drudge, I think people like Instapundit, Reason Magazine. I mean, Reason, Reason has always been a little magazine or an alternative magazine. We didn't have access to, the New York Times or whatever counts as the establishment. In an internet age, we were able to, and that was largely a function of money because, in order to distribute and market a print magazine, you just need cash and a lot of direct mail. You don't need that anymore. It doesn't mean it's easy to gain an audience because the very technology that enables you to reach more people also enables them to turn you off or say, hey, I got my own shit going on here. I don't care. But overall, it is like a deregulation, and we know that in markets that get deregulated, all kinds of interesting innovation and a kind of dispersion of power, kind of is suffused throughout the system, and that's generally a good thing.
Yeah, and I think also kind of the dark side of having so much more information is that we have so much more information. And I think we're starting to see this kind of rather disturbing trend of people starting to kind of silo. And then what you end up having is you have people who are just going to their specific places because they say the things that they like to hear. And so
do you really believe that? I mean, I'm not accusing you of anything. I mean, but is that how you act? Because and the reason I challenge you on this is because I think that theory is absolutely, it totally makes sense, and there's no question when you talk about people who define themselves first and foremost by kind of partisan political affiliations. I think you see that where, hardcore Democrats are not spending a lot of time watching Fox News, and hardcore Republicans are definitely not watching MSNBC or something. But I think for most of us who don't, who are not, just acting like minions for established kind of tribes, for me, it's like I read much more widely than I used to because I can. And I go to aggregator sites like Arts and Wonders Daily or even the Drudge Report, or even Google News and things like that. And like you get, I think, a wider variety of sources unless you are really working overtime not to see stuff that might upset you.
I try to keep it pretty broad, just in order to be a well-rounded person, so that I can make the commentary that I make and I do the things that I do, but I'm also somebody who spends a lot of time doing this, and I'm wondering if people who don't spend as much time consuming news content as we do that, because it does take a lot of time, and sometimes it's just easier to go to the place that says the things that you like, and then it gives this kind of, if we're making a libertarian argument here, this market force reason for whatever platform it is to go further and further and further to the extreme to try to appease these people.
And again, I think in politics, you can see that happening on almost every level within political parties. Activists are kind of constantly pushing things to the extreme because they're trying to purify themselves, and they move out from the center. Not necessarily a bad thing either, but there are more niche markets. One of the things I wrote a lot about the rise of kind of this post gatekeeper culture in the 90s, and one of the things that always stuck with me was back in the late 60s, the Beverly Hillbillies was like, for a couple of years was the most watched TV show. It was just hugely popular. And it's actually a really good show, by the way, if you ever get a chance to watch it. It's very funny in a kind of classic satire and, just kind of a theatrical structure. But when Seinfeld in the late 90s was the number one show in America, its audience wouldn't have placed it in the top 10 of the top shows in 1968 because more people were watching stuff, but fewer people were watching any one thing. I see that generally as a triumph. I think there's some reasons to worry about it a little bit, but it's kind of like in a piece I wrote for Reason in like 98 or 99 called All Culture All the Time. I liken this kind of freedom, this deregulation of the cultural sphere, to the end of an established church in England in the 17th century. people then were really afraid that if you got rid of the Church of England and mandatory church attendance, that there would be no religion, or there would only be religious wars. And what happened in the end was that there were a proliferation of sects, and a lot of conversation and kind of more participation in religion, including a principled atheism. And it's a good thing. And especially, that's one of the benefits about, I think, being libertarian is that you don't need to want to live in a world, and I think generally you don't, where there are one or two big things that define the mainstream, and then you might, if you're lucky, you get to have a little, satellite that orbits this stuff. It's just, we don't need a mainstream. All we have is like this, horn of plenty in front of us that we can, kind of roam around in, and we'll find, it's more like it's a buffet. It doesn't mean that, because we don't because we can, we don't eat steak every night. We go to a Golden Corral and eat a lot of different foods, whatever strikes our fancy, and then end up with type 2 diabetes.
Yeah,
we have better drugs and dialysis and everything to deal with that. So it's all good. It's all good.
It's fine. You'll still live to be 100. We got drugs. Yeah. It's fine. It's all good.
I'm a big I realize this does not comport with certain types or certain definitions of kind of libertarian ideas and whatnot. But for me, it's kind of like, and this is something that I pull out of Ludwig von Mises, but who talked about man as the choosing animal, in praxeology, the act of choosing is what defines us. And it's like, when you have more choices, we kind of are more human. And I think we're certainly more free. And then there are times to worry about, like, do we get to such a kind of balkanization of culture, of society, where we have nothing in common, which might not be a bad thing, except then if, we're in smaller and smaller kind of affiliated groups, and then one of those groups decides, we want to start running all of the other ones, that can be a problem. But generally speaking, I think, having more entertainment options, having more lifestyle options, having more food options, more clothing options, more gender options, et cetera, that's all good.
Yeah, I'm definitely someone who tends to favor more options for everyone. I'm glad we've gone from having like 3 stations on the TV to however many we have, because I don't know.
And who even cares, right, about TV anymore? Or like, well, there's TV channels, and then there's the internet, and there's it's an infinite variety.
And then you have streaming services now, and I don't even know how to work my remote, so I have no idea how many channels I have anymore.
And it is interesting, supposedly social scientists look at a lot of stuff, like even when you have a ton of choices, and this comports with my cable viewing, I probably watch like 5 or 6 channels a lot. So even though I have, I don't know, 200 channels or whatever the fuck it is, I kind of steer, I'm following a well-worn path, but, sometimes that changes, or I stumble across something while I'm scrolling through cable, et cetera. So I think it's good.
Yeah, it's nice to just have the choice there, but I think a lot of people, there's starting to be kind of this backlash, and we all make fun of the Bernie Sanders quote, but it's true about him going on about why we need so many different kinds of deodorant. It's like, well, because we do, because why not? But
well, I always think about that in terms of like sex or, sexual orientation. It's like, well, why do we need 3 or 4 kinds of orientations? Why not just 2, or 1? Why don't we just have heterosexuality as defined by whoever? It's like, we want to, I guess to harp on this a little bit more. What happened at some point in the 90s, and, you can see it coming for hundreds of years, but because of technology, because I think of increases in wealth, and I think the breakdown, and it's not coincidental, but the breakdown of a lot of gatekeeper institutions, big, hoary old establishments that were in power and really important because, the Cold War was going on and this and that. You had this mass breakout of hyper-personalization and individualization. And, finally, you didn't have to you didn't have to squeeze yourself into one of 3 or 4 existing boxes, on whatever we're talking about. Instead, like you could create your own box, and you could, endlessly kind of tailor what you were doing, what you were wearing, how you were living to whatever you wanted at that moment in time. And our desires change over time, so we can explore more and roam around. And where I worry about things, and I think I sense similar worry in you on a certain level, is that there does seem to be a consolidation going on in terms of when I look at the internet, and when there is a certain kind of a consolidation of the Wild West days. And maybe this is just like an old man talking about the Wild West days. Things have been civilized a little bit, and it's not quite as raucous. It's not quite as freewheeling. But I think in general, there's still an endless number of opportunities. There are whole continents and planets yet to be discovered, in this new era where you can kind of strike out on your own, whether we're talking about media or whatever, and kind of, let your freak flag fly.
Yeah, and I do think the 90s is a really good case study in kind of how things are different today as contrasted to them. I've always said one of the happiest coincidences of my life is that I got to be a teenager in the 90s, and I think that really has done a lot to shape my worldview, and I think that there is a reason why there is this little bumper crop of libertarians anywhere from their mid-30s to early 40s, because we all grew up in that era, so we're used to that kind of very just vast, wide open, everything free for all, do your own thing, pick your own stuff. And it seems to me like ever since then there's been this contraction back from that, trying to go back to more standard rigid roles, and it confuses the hell out of me, to be completely honest. I have no idea where
I think what part of what's going on too is I agree with you, and it's also that and I, of course so I'm like a late baby boomer and you're a Gen X then or something, right? And it's so we have something in common, and it's I really want to always guard against just being the kids today are pussies or whatever, and I don't think it's just a youth thing, but they're in the 90s, there was still this idea that you could be different, you could be yourself, and you could disagree with people, and it didn't mean that one of you was evil or one of you was rotten, or even that one of you had to take it. Whereas now, there's this promise of, infinite difference, but it seems like you're not supposed to have disagreements with people, and so there's this urge to kind of shut down any kind of conversation that might become a little bit tense, any kind of disagreement, any kind of substantial conflict, because I want to eat vegan and you want to be Jordan Peterson and only eat whiskey and steak or something.
How did you know my diet?
Are you a whiskey and steak person? All right, fair enough. Good for you. And again, we could meet at the Golden Corral.
Yes, there's options for everybody at the Golden Corral. Why can't everything just be like the Golden Corral?
Well, I will tell you, and this might be a good metaphor for critics of this kind of cornucopic vision. I used to live either full-time or part-time in Oxford, Ohio for 20 years, and which is a small college town outside of Cincinnati. And near there in Hamilton, Ohio, which was this kind of post-industrial hellhole, there was a Golden Corral, and I would take my kids there on a regular basis. And it eventually, everybody there was gargantuanly fat. People would be going to the chocolate, marshmallow, caramel fountains for dessert and, get into a big pile up in their motorized rascal scooters. It was not, it was an unhealthy scene, but that Golden Corral closed down, and literally it is now a kidney dialysis place. And so, I could see people saying, well, that's what happens when you have too many options or too much freedom. People don't know how to live. They don't know how to regulate their desires, and they end up screwing it all up. And that is something that you hear from, I think there's a version of that on the progressive left. Left to their own devices, we will burn the planet, now because we have no sense of the long term. And then on the conservative right, it's, you will just slake your gluttony and your sexual desires so much that you become just a waste product who can't really work. You're only a grasshopper, and you don't store ahead for the winter or something.
And then there's us libertarians who are just like, well, if that's what you want to do, go eat all day at the chocolate fountain. That is your business.
Right. Well, as long as you don't expect me to drive you to dialysis, right?
Exactly.
And one of the things, though, and I guess this is a little bit different than the media stuff, although it there's a question of, like, do we believe fundamentally in a free society? Are people basically self-regulating? Because, and I tend to think so. I mean, yeah, there's always fat shits or drug addicts. I mean, or people who abuse certain types of license. But by and large, people actually do a pretty good job of keeping it together. So that they don't become complete charges on other people. And I think, as you're right to say, like, and of course they do have, you do have an absolute right to kind of destroy yourself. But the fact is that, oftentimes our choices and options in life, in media, and, whatever, are restricted, for our own good, or for the good of social stability. And that's almost always just a cloak for, raw power to say, live the way that I want to. I don't like you having your choice.
Yeah, and there's definitely a resurgence of that, especially with people wanting to come in and start regulating media companies and start regulating tech companies and saying, okay, well, you got to put on this and not put on that. It's like, no, stop it. Especially on the federal government level, like, now y'all need to stop.
Yep, I agree. And, this is one of the things that is truly terrifying I think in the current political moment is that, for people will talk about Trump as being authoritarian, and there's elements of that, but, certainly among all of the Democratic presidential candidates, and the leading ones especially, they are basically devoted to saying we're going to break up Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, or Google and YouTube, et cetera, because they are too big or they're too powerful. And it's like, that's like a pretty naked power grab, because whatever else you can say about, these big tech companies is that we still have the option of opting out of them. And the world is, there are many, many places where we can go and, start our, online communes and live however the hell we want and communicate the way we want. That will go away if, the federal government starts saying, no, you have to get approval before you write certain things, or you have to do things our way. Otherwise, we'll shut you down.
Yeah, and on that note, I think we can leave off on that for a while, because that opens up a whole nother can of worms that I can spend another 3 hours talking about, because that's just one of my own personal. So
can I say, and if I may, to go back to your original comment, or to kind of spin that out now a little bit more, it's really kind of interesting if you are kind of like a transitional life form from, a pre-internet world to a post-internet world, or an internet world, as I guess I am. Again, one of the reasons that I really, really like the current moment, and I don't worry about the future of journalism or of media, certainly, and of cultural production, is that, we now have print magazines that are more interesting and more beautiful and just like more of a thing of beauty to hold and a thing of delight than ever. And we have all of this other stuff. And, one of the, what is different is that print doesn't dominate the way that it might have once. And, there's an analogy here between newspapers were, I guess kind of first became knowable in kind of something similar to current form in the late 18th, early 19th century. And then, by the beginning of the 20th century, newspapers were big, important things. I think like daily newspapers, people reading them. Radio comes along and it kind of supplants some of that. TV, movies come along, TV. None of this meant that any of these old forms fully disappeared. It just meant that none of them are hegemonic anymore. And people are constantly talking about how, TV killed movies. And it's like, and radio, TV killed radio, which had killed this. And, and in the end, what you end up with is just a lot of different stuff, and no one form, no one medium tends to dominate. And I think a lot of the complaints about the decline of quality or the fear of disintegration, it's just somebody who was really into this form is kind of pissed that, oh, well, radio isn't that big anymore. TV is bigger, and now we're in a post-TV world, et cetera. And that it's worth kind of, working through that kind of anxiety, acknowledging it, and then saying, just relax a little bit. I've been thinking a lot about this lately because of Martin Scorsese's recent rampage against Marvel superhero movies versus his stuff. But then also, like, as he was releasing The Irishman, a $159 million movie that Netflix financed for him and gave him, full creative control on. That's why it's 3.5 hours long. And they even gave him a limited theatrical run. He was bitching and moaning in the New York Times, which is a perfect place for this, to be like, oh, nobody cares about movies anymore, cinema, going to the theater. And he made a bunch of false statements. There are more movie screens than ever in America, and they are better. The movie palaces of today are fucking great. Like, they have great seats. You can get real food. You can get drinks. The sound quality, the variety of stuff that is offered is bigger and better than ever. But it's going to the movie theater isn't the one thing that people do anymore. It's one of many options, including staying at home and watching Netflix, on your TV or on your fucking phone. Like, at one point he was like, don't watch my movie on your phone. And it's like, hey, how about this? Go fuck yourself. It's like the whole point of technology and of innovation and of freedom is that I can, that the producer doesn't get to dictate to me how I do stuff.
And even over and beyond that, once you get to a certain point of having all these choices, people actually start kind of cycling back around to the older choices, like people who, like myself, prefer to have physical books instead of stuff on Kindle. Right. Or even if you want to talk about podcasts, like when podcasts were first launched, 15, 20 years ago, really popular, and then it kind of died down, and now it's blown back up again. It's like people kind of cycle back around to the older things once you kind of get tired of the new things. Yeah, and also, and in another way, they also kind of fetishize the past that is being displaced. So, this is, when recorded music started becoming a thing, one of the first things that was done is that a ton of like old folk songs were preserved on record and things like that. And, and now we've gotten to a point where, and this has been going on for, 10 years or more, but where there's this fetishistic love of vinyl. Nobody needs vinyl anymore, but it's weird. Like, preservation kicks in at the moment that more options are available. And so I think it's a big win overall. It's a stupid way of putting it. But then people get bent out of shape because the thing they like, the thing that they've built their whole life around, or what means the most to them because of their identity and whatever issues they have, not always a bad thing, but like, they're mad that, like, I've got this great thing that I love, that I grew up with, and that defines me. And you're telling me you want to watch my movie, on an Apple phone, like, or an Apple Watch. It's like, no, I made it to be seen this way. And it's like, this again is, for me, is very libertarian, is that we live in an age of mass production, or, but it's become hyper individualized, and the producer, the power, the authority, the voice, the priest speaking from the pulpit, they don't get to decide as much anymore. They've been pulled down into the audience, and we all get a chance to kind of to comment on what the producer is doing, and then kind of adapt it to how we want it to fit into our lives. It's very liberating. And kind of on the topic of things that have changed and evolved and grown over the years, obviously you have been in the libertarian movement for probably about as long as I've been alive.
Well, I consider my, the beginning of being kind of like a professional libertarian as when I started at Reason. So like for about 26 years now. Yeah.
Okay. So ever since I was a preteen, let's put it that way.
All right. I'm not trying to get you to cop to your age or anything. I'm just, it's been like a good quarter of a century for sure.
So how have things kind of changed since you first came into the movement as to where we're at now? Because I mean, I've been in this for about 10 years now. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I was part of the Ron Paul bumper crop,
right?
But even in this 10 years, I've seen quite a shift that's happened. So I was curious to see how you feel about this.
Well, you know what? Like this kind of dynamic of proliferation of identities or types within, and you see it with, I used to give a talk about Pop-Tarts, how Pop-Tarts started in the mid-'60s. Kellogg's brought them out, and there were originally 4 flavors that all kind of looked the same and tasted the same. And then by the '90s, they were offering, like at any given time, about 35 or 40 different types of Pop-Tarts that all looked different, that were time-limited, et cetera, and that was kind of a shorthand for what had happened in every aspect of American life, and really of global life in that period, where wherever you had 1 or 2 or 3 versions of something, suddenly you had just a dozen or an infinite number of choices, and that includes, again, it includes kind of racial and ethnic diversity. Suddenly people were much more mixed than they used to be, or acknowledging that they were more mixed, and gender and sexual orientation, but also clothing and lifestyle and religion. And I think that also holds true for libertarianism. I can tell you, when Reason, founded in 1968 by a guy who was, I guess, not a hardcore Randian, but he was objectivist enough to name the magazine Reason, which is, for Rand, that's the faculty that makes humans different than animals. And when I showed up at Reason, I would say most of the people I met, and not just at the magazine, but in the movement, I would say, Ayn Rand was like a huge person who brought people in. I think Milton Friedman was a big thing. And Robert Heinlein, the science fiction writer, as well. And nowadays, you definitely Ron Paul since 2008 and on, and he had obviously been, kind of doing the spade work on this and planting, kind of long germinating seeds for decades before that. But he is huge. I think the rise of groups like the Cato Institute and Reason Magazine and whatnot, the libertarian movement has kind of developed, and it has a lot of, it's like Howard Johnson's, instead of having 2 or 3 flavors, maybe it's got 36 flavors, and that's constantly growing. So I think there's that going on, and the movement is actually bigger as well. It was. So there's all of that. The other things that I think are interesting to me are how libertarianism is kind of intersected with kind of traditional or more conventional political ideologies and social and cultural ideologies in America. And, I think we have, broadly speaking, libertarians have essentially defeated social conservatism. There are social cons out there. There's a new movement among certain kinds of right-wingers to actually reject classical liberalism and the idea that the state should be a kind of impartial judge to creates a framework by which people can pursue happiness, how they define it, as long as they're not fucking people up too much. There's a whole group of new conservatives who are like, no, the state should be defining what the good life is, and then all of its policy should be pushing people to pursue that singular vision. That's doomed to die. And, every social issue that conservatives have championed over the past 50 or 70 years, they've lost, and they'll continue to lose. On the left, I think one of the things that's interesting is that libertarians have really kind of pushed them in positive ways on things like drug legalization, on things like immigration for the most part, on things like criminal justice reform, and also a kind of deregulation of information to kind of take those ideas seriously, and in many cases claim them as their own. We see a backlash against free information and free communication. But in many ways, all of the Democratic candidates, just as a starting point, kind of believe in a bunch of libertarian things where the state should not be dictating what is possible, but rather getting out of the way, and also minimizing its footprint on the necks of people in terms of things like criminal justice reform and doing sentencing reform, getting rid of the drug war. So that's all good. Does that get to some of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think. Obviously, we had the much ballyhooed libertarian moment where there was we did have that brief shining moment. I was there. I remember it fondly.
Yes.
And now I'm very sad that it's gone.
I want to go back, and I feel like I'm in Man in the High Castle, and I want to go back to that alternative timeline and just kind of hang out with it for a little bit longer. And here's the question, though, is that, are the things that gave rise to the libertarian moment, and that's a phrase, actually, that Matt Welch and I coined at Reason and popularized, and it got to that, and it was very much built around the kind of rise. We wrote about that in 2007, 2008, but it was very much tied both to kind of the emergence of Ron Paul and the Ron Paul phenomenon, and then Rand Paul in a couple years later as a kind of Tea Party favorite. And the New York Times wrote about, excuse me, had a cover story. The New York Times Magazine had a cover story that said, "Has the libertarian moment finally arrived?" And, Rand Paul was on the cover. And unfortunately, what that certifies is that trends go to the New York Times to die. So, like, by the time you read about something in the New York Times, it's over.
Damn it.
Yeah. And it's kind of, having said that, I think the libertarian impulse is not gone. We're in a fight now because, there's a great classical liberal political scientist and historian, an old guy named Arthur E. Kirch Jr., who's dead. But he wrote a great book called The Decline of American Liberalism, and he said that from the colonial period on, American history and American culture has always been about forces of centralization and decentralization, and that at various points one is winning out. And I think we were in a spasm of decentralization after the end of the Cold War, even after 9/11, but there were these huge forces that were military, deep state type stuff, as well as economic, as well as cultural, that were trying to centralize stuff again. And you saw that a lot in many ways under George W. Bush and Obama. I think you're seeing some of it under Trump or, the current moment. But there's still a lot of push to decentralize and to let, that people can escape control. And I think that's, the fundamental element of a libertarian moment. And I think that's ongoing in many ways.
And I think part of that, too, is a new kind of framing that I'm seeing a lot of people within the libertarian movement make that I think would actually be beneficial going forward, is that instead of looking at things as like a left-right dichotomy, looking at things as like authoritarian versus freedom. And I think going forward, especially since both parties seem determined to do this, whatever the fuck this thing is that they're both doing,
right. But it is authoritarian, right? Like they're saying, we want to limit your choices, and we want to, they're not totalitarian. They're not saying we're going to dictate everything, but they're definitely saying we want to limit you in various ways so that you live more according to our lives. And that, if you replace right and left or liberal and conservative with authoritarian and libertarian, I think that's a great way of framing things. And I also, one of the things that I think is also important is that to think about these less as concrete lists, like kind of a checklist of here are 10 policies. And if you don't agree with all of them, then you're not a libertarian or whatever. It's not like a dogma list or something. It's more, these are predispositions, these are mindsets, these are temperaments. And are you more libertarian or more authoritarian? Do you think people should have fewer choices or more choices in every aspect of their lives? I think that, that's where I've become less doctrinaire and less dogmatic, and I'm more interested in kind of what I sometimes call adjectival, or I think Michael Munger, a political scientist at Duke, calls directional libertarianism. Like, are you kind of moving toward, is your default setting, more freedom, and then are you moving in that direction or not? But it's not about saying, if you don't believe in the non-aggression principle, if you don't believe in this, if you don't believe in that, if you don't believe in these things, then you are not just not libertarian, but you are my enemy, and screw you all.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of kind of ditching the purity test thing, because I don't think it's particularly helpful or instructive at this point, especially if you're trying to bring more people into the movement. It's you got to kind of meet people where they're at, and you can't just beat people over the head with shit and then be like, well, if you don't agree with me on everything right now, then you can't be in my club. And it's like,
although I assume that we agree that, when the sidewalks are privatized, that's like the one thing that we really need to get done, is to, get rid of the post office and privatize the sidewalks, and then everything else will take care of itself.
Exactly, because I need to set up my toll for my private sidewalk so I can start monetizing my sidewalk.
That, and in a lot of ways, that I don't know if this tracks exactly. I think within the libertarian movement there is the much ballyhooed discussion of kind of cosmotarians versus kind of either I don't know exactly what is the opposite of the cosmotarian, but the kind of rural versus urban split, or localist versus cosmopolitan, et cetera. That's a tension that has definitely been growing within the movement, at least over the time that I've been part of it.
Or maybe Beltway libertarian versus outside the Beltway libertarian?
Yeah, although, this is, kind of, but it's in a way, like I say that, I'm talking to you from New York. I'm on the Lower East Side. I lived full-time in D.C., I think, for 2 years. And and I know Reason sometimes is called cosmotarian or Beltway, even though we're based in California. So, yeah, I get where that's coming from. And it's, but I don't know that it's accurate, or it's probably a broader term than is meaningful in any kind of way.
I think it makes a certain assumption about people that isn't entirely true, and it's just an easier way to dismiss people as saying, well, you go to the DC cocktail parties, and it's like, first of all, libertarians don't get invited to cocktail parties in DC. Let me tell y'all, we don't get invited to cocktail parties.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, except for Suderman's cocktail parties, but those are different.
Yeah, well, I have not been at a Suderman cocktail party, so if you have, you're one up on me. Please bring me as a +1 sometime. But the other thing that is actually may also be, or I think is an interesting thing for libertarians to think about as we gain in numbers and kind of have more fights to pick amongst ourselves too, is this a question of like, is libertarianism fundamentally about an individual's relationship to the state or to government at whatever level, or is it a broader kind of sense of a life well lived? Because this is one of the things that I think a lot about, and these are mostly old timers, but they'll be like, because the government is objectively bigger than it's ever been, and every year it gets objectively bigger, and the debt gets bigger, and the number of regulations and all of this stuff happens, and people will say, some libertarians will say, well, when the government gets like $1 bigger or 1 inch bigger, then we lose freedom, et cetera. And there's a lot of truth to that. And, there's no question that the federal government, state governments, local governments, government at every level should be, much, much smaller than it is. But it's also true that freedom and power exist outside of the size and scope of government. And we need to start looking at where are other forms of power and coercive or controlling power in our lives, and have those been kind of been minimized in a way that we end up, even if the government is getting a little bit bigger, we're more free. And like in a way, in the 1950s and I guess even in the 60s and whatnot, the government was getting bigger, but then also things like organized religion had much more power over people's lives. And in a lot of ways, corporations, if you worked at a place like IBM or AT&T or Xerox or something, that corporate structure had a lot more say over your life than they do now. And so the government could keep getting bigger, but those sources of power are no longer as powerful. And, are we more or less free than we were 50 years ago? I think how you answer that question and how you approach that question, and then where you come down at the end, that's a big distinction within the libertarian movement right now. And I think it's a productive tension. It's a good conversation, but it leads to a lot of, pretty nasty arguments.
That is true. It does lead to nasty arguments. And it's kind of an interesting hypothesis that you put forth, especially since this is kind of how I compare, like, especially like with weed legalization. Mm-hmm. You can make the argument that this all started because a bunch of people just decided that they were going to smoke weed, fuck the law. And then so eventually it got to the point where you got cities and then states that have decided to legalize or decriminalize in whatever way, shape, or form they choose to do it. And I think that is going to ultimately lead to federal legalization, because it's just going to reach a certain point where it's stupid and it's nonsense. So there is an argument to be made that even though the state is trying to exert a certain amount of control over you, you can either accept that or decline it. And I mean, obviously declining it, you run the risk of having the state do whatever they're going to do, but there is kind of like a little civil disobedience kind of thing there that I think is worth talking about.
Oh, I agree completely. And, and it's a combination of things too, right? Because it is the people who are, have the brassest balls, who are just like, I don't fucking care. Like, I'm going to live my life and come and get me, and that happens. People disappear all the time because they contravene existing law and kind of codes of conduct. But they, and this is kind of Thaddeus Russell's argument in Renegade History of the United States, but those people, even if they are disappeared and we forget about them, they tend to expand the possibilities of freedom for the people who come after them. And, I think there's definitely a case to be made that, and this is a shitty metaphor, but, that the garden of freedom is fertilized or is watered by the blood of martyrs, whose names we don't even know. I feel very strongly that somebody like Ross Ulbricht, the founder of the Silk Road website, who is rotting in jail. He's not rotting, he's thriving in jail of all things, but he's going to live the rest of his life in prison. And in his lifetime, everything that Silk Road, like he got put in jail for doing, will be completely legal and it'll be completely monetized, and the government will be regulating and taxing it and talking about how great it is. This happens all the time. There's also the people, and when you think about something like drug legalization, there are also the people who work within the system or co-opt the system to start changing the laws and to say, at a local level, we're going to get the police to say we're not going to enforce marijuana laws, and then at the state level they're going to say we're going to allow medical exemptions for the use of marijuana, and then suddenly you get to full-blown legalization. There's a great book by Alberto Hirschman, who's a political economist, called in like around 1970 or 71, called "Exit, Voice, and Loyalty," and the subtitle is something like "Responses to Firms, States, and Organizations in Decline." And he was basically saying, like, how do you affect social change? And he came up with, three broad responses when things are, when people are chafing under control. And one is loyalty, which is that you just kind of go along with like what your company says you need to do or your country says you need to do, and you just suck it up and become a company man. Voice is that you work within the system to try and affect change and reform. And then there's also exit, where you just leave and you do your own thing. And that it's a mix of all of these things that really are the ways in which things change. And I think, there's a strong argument, and this is very people like James Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winning economist, talked a lot about how the right of exit or the threat of exit, where you're just going to leave, is the most important one, because it both gives you the ability to leave and do your own thing. But it's also, if a society, if a power base knows that you can leave them, they will act more kindly to you because they realize they can't just tell you what to do. And I think it's a combination of all of those things. And I think libertarians, I think we will benefit by taking more seriously the idea of, both of exit, voice, and loyalty, and when to use what strategy to affect the change you want. But also if we start thinking about things beyond simple government power. And, there's definitely a difference between our relationship with the state and with, say, Amazon or something, or the Catholic Church. But all of these things exert power, and, recognizing that and then figuring out how to deal with that is, will expand the sphere of individual freedom.
Well, on that positive, uplifting note, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. So, Nick, thank you for sitting down and talking with me about all of the things.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. I really welcome it. And, I do want to just plug my podcast, The Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. You go to reason.com/podcast. But thank you so much for this. It's a great conversation, and I'll look forward to seeing you the next time you truck on up to the Soho Forum.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to let you and probably about 3 dozen other people know next time I'm up in New York City. But again, thank you for sitting down with me.
Thanks very much.
So that was my interview with Nick. Like I said, it's long, it goes places. I personally enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. And like I said at the beginning, if you do subscribe to the Reason Podcast, remember that there are 3 streams now. So if you want all of the content, you need to go and subscribe to all 3 of those streams. So, as usual, At this point, I will go ahead and wrap this up. And as always, if you did make it this far, thank you. And if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and on my Patreon page. Take care, and until next time.